what are the implications of the agreement, and how will the process work from now. And I want to talk a bit about that because that's where we're going to have to continue to get active. Right? So I want to set out in advance what the process is going to be. The government is going to tell us next Thursday, when it has the ministers from the other countries to sign the agreement, that that's the end of it. So forget about it. Nothing more you can do. That's it. Done deal. Laurie is going to give you an awful lot of food for thought to explain why that's not the case. But here, the story that Laurie is going to tell means that we're going to have to spend at least the next 18 months to 2 years continuing to fight against this agreement becoming enforceable against us and within this country. First thing I want to do is to explain a little bit about some quite confusing terms that are used, because people have been thinking that this is actually already binding on New Zealand, or it will be on next Thursday. Right? So let me just explain the little sequence. When the ministers met in Atlanta a few months ago now and did the deal, that was the political trade-offs. Right? That was what they did there. They did the horse trading. Right? At the end of that, they then released what they said was a text of what they'd agreed to. That wasn't binding at all. Right? That was what they had agreed to in a rough form, a rough draft. Then they had to set about what we call scrubbing it, which is not sanitizing it, sadly. They're just working out the contradictions of the legal terminology and so on. What they will sign next Thursday is that scrubbed letter, along with a whole lot of side letters which are between countries that involve additional agreements or clarification between them. And that will set out the terms of the agreement as it is now. And they will tell us that's the final version, but it will not be the final version. The week after that, they will introduce to Parliament the text and another piece of fiction called the National Interest Analysis. Now, the National Interest Analysis is supposed to be an official cost-benefit analysis of the agreement. It is a total snow job. It is written by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade that negotiated the deal. They're hardly going to go and say, we negotiated a deal that has all these problems in it. It is an expansion of the fiction sheets that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade produced after the negotiations were concluded. They have a lot of exaggeration, which I'm going to explain shortly, and they don't mention virtually any of the downsides. So they will table the text and the NIA, which I'm now dubbing the National Government's Interest Analysis, in the House, and that will get referred to the Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Committee. Now that committee will then call for submissions on the agreement. And we will be told that this is the democratic process where we can have our say. And in a way it is, and we need to take advantage of that. We need to put in as many submissions as possible, and we need to force the Select Committee to go to as many parts of the country as possible. But in a technical constitutional sense, it is irrelevant. It's important politically, but technically, the Cabinet, 15 sitting days after they have tabled the text in Parliament, can make it binding on New Zealand. Now, they won't do that because of the furore that we've picked up about the agreement. They will wait for the Select Committee to conduct its hearing. Of course, it has a majority on the Select Committee. However, there are other parties on there who are opposed to the agreement. And they can produce their own minority reports, and now thankfully the Labour Party has actually come out and said that it is also opposed to the agreement, that they will produce a minority report as well, which I hope will be a little bit more robust than the one they did on the Korea agreement. Yeah? However, even if that committee recommended changes to the agreement, the government can ignore it. So again, it's the politics of the select committee that is important for us. We mustn't get too carried away about being able to make changes to the agreement. Then the government does not need to put the agreement to a vote in the House. If Labour was going to support it, they might. But given that Labour has said they won't, the only reason the government will put it to a vote, knowing that it will get passed by the two parties of one, is if they want to embarrass Labour by getting Phil Goff to cross the floor and vote as well. And it's possible they might do that. But even if they put it to a vote, that vote is also meaningless. Because even if Parliament voted against it, the Cabinet can still ratify it. The next step is, however, the only thing where Parliament does have a say. There will need to be some changes to some New Zealand laws. Some of them will be minor. Changes to the Tariffs Act, Trade Remedies Act, and so on. They will have to change the law for foreign investment and lift the threshold at which foreign investment requires vetting. They will make a change to the copyright law, which is the longer period of protection for copyright, which will cost the libraries and so on. They will need to make some changes to the Patent Act, which will, in some relatively minor ways, affect medicines. They'll be affected in other ways that aren't part of the law. And so that will come up for a vote. But the Prime Minister, again, will be able to make that a confidence vote. And so he will be able to guarantee to pass that. However, all of this will take some time. And even when the government has passed that legislation, and even if the government says it is now going to ratify the agreement, that is to say New Zealand will accept it to be binding on us, that's the difference between signing and ratifying, the agreement itself will not come into force until another thing happens. There is a 2-year period. If during that 2 years all of the 12 countries says, yay, we're going to bring this into force, we've done all our domestic processes and it's go. At that stage, the TPPA would become live and binding on us. But it is very unlikely that all 12 are going to do that within that 2-year period. So they have a fallback position. If at the end of that 2 years there are 6 or more countries that together make up 85% of the GDP of the 12, that means the big ones, must be Japan, must be the US, can't come into force unless they have done their thing. And a couple of the others, 6 all up, if they all say yay, then the agreement will become live for them. That means the US and Japan have a veto. The agreement will not come into force until they notify that what they think is necessary for all the other countries to comply with the agreement has been done. Which means the US can say, you little New Zealand, you haven't done what we think you need to do. So we're not going to notify that it's acceptable for you to be a party until you do this bit extra and you do that bit extra and you do that bit extra. So the US will exercise some leverage over a period of time to try to get us to do more. And Laurie's going to talk about the gory details of that. if we're not in the first batch, they will try to blackmail us further. Because if you're not in the first 6 or the first group, they can say, well, now you want to join, do you? Well, you have to do not only what you've agreed to in the agreement, you have to do these extra things as well. And so that will be the pressure that they will be putting on for us to be a part of the club at the beginning. So we get screwed every step of the way. Now the good news and the reasons why we have to keep fighting this process is that it is extremely unlikely that any of those steps will be concluded before the next election in this country. And that means if we can have a government with parties that are committed to this agreement not coming into force, we can hold off the tsunami. And that is why it is really important for us to maintain the pressure on the political parties to make sure they don't cave, and to make it clear that this is an election issue, and to make it clear to National as well that it's an election issue. Last night there was a business person who was the last speaker who said, I don't think this is good for business in New Zealand. He said, you need to go and talk to the National Party. You need to talk to the National MPs and tell them that this will cost them in their constituencies, especially the ones who have marginal constituencies. In Auckland, at the end of the town hall meeting, there was someone who was a former senior executive of the dairy industry who said the same thing to me. So we need the people who are actually in the rural communities, Nigel, to go and actually at least ask questions and seek answers. So I wanted to spend a bit of time on that because I think it's really important, especially when you listen to Laurie, to not feel that next week is it. That we can and we must continue to make a difference.